I would like to start my presentation with a short video clip, so please pay attention to the video clip. Could you please start the video? This is a very unfortunate situation. This is a very unfortunate cyclist. What goes wrong here? What's happening? He thinks he's won, and then he loses. He drops, and he's passed by someone else. Well, he's overconfident. That's what's going on. Not because it's Friday the 13th. He's just overconfident. And because he's overconfident, his performance actually decreases. He loses. And this nicely illustrates the topic of my presentation, which is that overconfidence in any situation can decrease performance and can cause underachievement. This overconfidence is a universal problem. It doesn't only happen to cyclists, but we see it in a lot of other situations in our society as well. For example, we see it in adolescents when we ask them about how they know to use a condom. They tend to think they're more knowledgeable than they actually are. And they also tend to underestimate the risk of contracting a sexually transmitted disease. And this, of course, can have dangerous consequences. Surgical residents. Studies have shown that surgical residents tend to think they are more skilled than they actually are. If you compare it to their performance on exams, their skills tend to be lower than they think they are. Could also have certain effects. The high trading that we see on the financial market can also be the result of overconfidence. Usually, these stock investors think that their stock will be more profitable than it actually is. And we also see it in education. College professors, studies in college professors, interestingly, have shown that when these college professors are asked, okay, how well do you think you are as a teacher? You think you are below average, around average, or above average? 94% of college professors think they are teaching above average, which is, of course, statistically impossible. Finally, student learning. Students tend to be overconfident after having taken an exam. When you ask them, what grade do you think you will get for this exam? You wouldn't say so, but most students tend to overrate their grade. But what exactly do we mean by overconfidence? I would like to go into that a little deeper. Well, overconfidence is a certain discrepancy between people's perceptions of their performance and actual reality. Let's go back to the example of the surgical residents. In this study, these surgical residents were asked to estimate their skills. So they were asked, how well do you think you are at certain surgical skills? And those surgical skills estimates were eventually compared to their performance on an objective standardized board exam. And a correlation is calculated between these two. And this correlation can indicate how well the estimates of performance correspond to actual performance. Now, what we find in research, studied by Maybe and West, has shown that this correlation is around 0.29. And knowing that a perfect correlation would be +1, this is, of course, it is fairly low. 0.29 is really low, actually. And what we see is that there's a large discrepancy and that students and teachers and also surgical residents tend to think they're doing much better than they actually are. So can this correlation be any higher? Are there situations in which people are less overconfident? Yes. In the case of constant, immediate, and objective feedback, we see this correlation increase to around 0.47. For example, in athletics, people race against the clock. So there's constant feedback, there's immediate feedback, and there's objective feedback, because the clock knows how well someone has done. Now, 0.47, of course, is still far from perfect. Can this correlation, does it get any lower? Yes, it does. In the opposite situation, when feedback is occasional, or when feedback is delayed, not immediate but delayed, and when feedback is ambiguous. And that is actually what we see in most real-life tasks, such as in managerial competence. Managers often do not get a lot of feedback. They get it on occasions. This feedback usually is not immediate, but only after a delay. And it usually is really ambiguous. It's not direct. It's a coworker who's being nudgy or a coworker who's being friendly, and that might say something about your performance as a manager. Then we see this correlation drop to around 0.04, which is just chance. And of course, the question rises, why are people so overconfident? Well, you could say that there are a lot of different theories about this, which could be grouped into 3 large clusters, and I would like to go into that. First of which is an information deficit. People do not have all the knowledge available that is necessary to make an accurate judgment of themselves and of their performance. For example, if you want to know whether an argument is logical, you need to know the rules of logic, and you need to know them well. So people lack or even ignore information that is crucial to make a good judgment of their performance. And the second reason is that performance is usually ill-defined. That is, it is hard to objectively determine when you are performing below or above average, especially in the usual everyday tasks that we find ourselves in. You can see that when you compare, for example, solving a mathematical problem, where the solution is clear, where you can really see whether you've understood it, and you can really accurately compare your performance to the performance that was accurate on the math problem, to the work of a manager. And for a manager, it's much harder to see when he's performing well and when he's not. So what people tend to do then is to define performance to their own advantage. So a highly socially skilled manager, for example, will define intelligence as being really sociable. And that, of course, in the end, will lead him also to see himself as above average. That's what causes this overconfidence. And then a final reason why people tend to be overconfident is that it looks like there could be an evolutionary adaptive function to this overconfidence. Research has shown in children that children that were most overconfident were actually the ones that were learning more and developing faster in certain situations. So this unrealistic optimism makes them take on challenges and makes them do things they would refrain from when they would be more realistic. So it looks like being unrealistically optimistic actually can stimulate development. But being an educational psychologist, I'm mainly interested in this group, students in a learning situation. And as I said, we also see the overconfidence there. Now, graphically, research has shown results like this. I'll walk you through this graph. In this graph, you can see in the blue line students' performance. And students were clustered in 4 groups, in performance groups. Now, in the lower left-hand corner, this group is the lowest performing students. And in the right-hand upper corner, you can see the highest performing students. And of course, the blue line indicates performance, so it increases from lower left hand to upper right hand. In the red line, you can see what they thought they would get on a particular exam that they were asked to guess their grade. And especially for these lower performing students, the discrepancy between their actual grade and their estimated grade is large. More than 50% of the students tend to overestimate their grade and are overconfident. Why is overconfidence in education so troublesome? Because you could say in itself, well, this overconfidence, well, makes people happy maybe. Well, we know that this overconfidence also affects learning. It affects the way students approach new learning tasks. If they think they already know it, they are less likely to study it. But in the same learning situation, if they think they already know something, they'll stop learning and take an exam. But they might need to restudy it. So this overconfidence leads to less study behavior, inaccurate study behavior. And we call this the study regulation. So how do students regulate their study behavior based on what they think about what they know? And I'll come back to this later. It's obvious that this less study behavior also has an effect on academic performance. So, in a sense, overconfidence could be seen as a contributor to suboptimal academic achievement. In my research, I'm mainly interested in this factor, and I'm interested in a factor that has not been looked at that much yet, which is namely the way our educational system and the way we teach our students affects this overconfidence. That is, how we instruct our students and how we grade our students influences their overconfidence. And therefore, if we change this, we might improve this and make them be more realistic about their study behavior. I would like to show you two studies in which I've looked at these factors, instruction and grading, in the rest of the presentation. So what does a typical study look like in this situation? A typical study would look something like this. Students are placed in a learning situation, and they are asked to read a number of texts, represented in the upper left-hand corner. In this case, we tested 12-year-old students. We asked them to read a number of interesting texts that were adapted to their level of knowledge, for example, about certain animals, about certain countries. And after they had done so, we, of course, asked them to estimate themselves. We asked them, okay, we're going to take a test now. How well do you think you will do on a test about these texts? But because we're also interested in how their estimations were going to influence their future learning, afterwards we also asked them, in the right-hand lower corner, we also asked them, okay, do you think you need to restudy some of these texts? And which ones would you want to restudy? Because we're interested in finding out how their estimations would influence their study behavior. That was the basic setup. But we inserted a manipulation. Half of the students were actually given an extra instruction prior to giving the estimation. So we wanted to influence the way they estimated. And we asked them, can you name, for each text, can you think of 5 keywords? And the idea behind this was that if they had to think of these keywords, they were actually self-testing their knowledge about the text. Could they name 5 keywords? Was it easy for them to do so? Was it difficult to do so? And that would help them make a better estimation. This is what we actually found. Looking at the results, students who had to give these 5 keywords, compared to those who didn't give the keywords, were much better at estimating their performance. Correlation between estimations and performance for those who had to name keywords were plus 0.44, compared to only plus 0.02 for those who did not provide keywords. So naming these keywords actually reduced overconfidence. But also, these students were better at choosing whether they needed to restudy some of the information and which information they needed to restudy. So these students more often chose the text for restudy that they didn't know. So this self-testing did have an effect on performance, and we could conclude from this that self-testing can reduce overconfidence. In a different study, we looked at the effect of grading. We used college students instead of primary school education students, and we had a similar setup. Students first read a number of texts on an interesting topic, and after they had done so, we actually gave them a test about the most important information from the text. And we wanted to know whether they could guess their grade. And we did that by asking them for each question that they answered, how well did you think you did on this test? How well did you do on the test? And of course, we're also interested in how this again affected how they would further restudy. And we asked them to restudy the text and select which text they wanted to restudy. Now in this case, we did something else. We manipulated the way we asked them to estimate their performance. Half of the students were given what I would say is sort of a traditional instruction. That is actually the way we grade our students. For every answer they give on a test, we decide, is this answer not correct? Is it partially correct? Or is it fully correct? And that's what the students were asked as well. Do you think this answer you provided is not correct? Or is it partially correct? Or is it fully correct? The other half of the students were actually given a much more stricter criterion. They had to answer the question, okay, you gave this answer. Do you think this answer is indeed fully correct? And we were wondering how that would affect their overconfidence. Now, looking at the results, we found that when students were given the traditional instruction of no partial or fully correct, they were overconfident on 64% of the answers, which is, of course, quite a lot. When they were given a more stricter criterion, actually overconfidence dropped. They were only overconfident on about 22% of the answers. What happened is that in the first situation, a lot of the students tended to give themselves partial credit for answers that were completely incorrect. So students have the tendency to think, well, I gave an answer, this is okay, I must at least receive some credit for it, although it was completely incorrect. Now, the other instruction shows that when you put them to the test and you ask them, are you sure that this is indeed correct? They show that they know that it is not. So somehow, deep down, they know their answers aren't fully correct, but they're just responding to the way that our educational system grades them. And they have a tendency to think, well, this is quite okay. But giving them a stricter criterion made them less overconfident, and it also showed that they were better at selecting which text they needed to restudy. So not only does it reduce overconfidence, but it also improves future learning behavior. So when we ask students to use stricter grading when estimating themselves, that actually also reduces overconfidence. I'm coming to the conclusion of my presentation. I wanted to show you today that overconfidence is a universal problem that seriously threatens students' learning. But there's an upside to this as well. It looks like we can reduce overconfidence by looking at how our educational system works and by changing some of the aspects of how we instruct and grade our students. And I've gave you some examples, namely that instructing students to self-test their knowledge by, for example, generating keywords, but we know that having them provide a summary has the same effect. But also by using a stricter criterion when grading them, can reduce overconfidence and can also improve their learning and academic achievement in the end. Now, to prevent future cycling accidents, I would like to give you a few take-home tips to reduce overconfidence. First of which is ask for feedback. Ask for feedback from peers or supervisors, preferably from supervisors, because they are most expert. We know that from research that peers and supervisors are much better at predicting performance than you yourself are. Also, self-test your knowledge. Use a test so you can see whether you know the information that you need to know. Usually what people tend to do is use superficial information when giving an estimate. But by self-testing, you can use better information. And use an objective standard. Look for an objective standard against which you can compare your performance. When you're reading a text and you have to provide some answers on a test, make sure that you have the correct standard against which you can see whether your answer actually is correct or not. I would like to thank you for your attention, and if there are any questions, I would be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annick. So, the floor is yours. Over there.
Yeah, thanks for your very inspiring presentation. I'm a bit puzzled. I think you were very convincing that being overconfident lowers effort and therefore has a negative effect on your performance. What I also know from the literature on optimism, even if it's in health science but also in economics, that optimism can be, and you also mentioned this, can have very positive effects on effort and on performance. So is it really a different concept, or does it mean that overconfidence is different for the, let's say, the lower tier of the distribution, those who perform worse, and could have a positive effect on those performing best? Mm-hmm. Or is it related to the task? I can, for instance, presume that when a good student is very optimistic on a very challenging master thesis, you should say, okay, let's do this. Even with a higher risk of not performing that well. Yeah. So what's your vision on this?
Yes, I think optimism is very important. It's very important in doing a lot of things, in taking on challenging tasks, in being willing to do new things. But it really depends, the effect of the overconfidence depends on the outcome measure. And in education, then you see the problem. Because in education you see that mainly the poor performing students are the ones who are overconfident. And that's when the overconfidence really has a detrimental effect. I can imagine that in health situations, it's good to be optimistic because the chance that you will have a very unlikely disease is very small. But for the poor performing student, the chance that he will get a very low grade is actually really high. So it depends on the outcome of the task, what you're measuring. That's what I would say.
Yeah, over there. Please tell us who you are. Introduce yourself.
Herman Kingma, Chair of the University Council. I enjoyed your talk a lot. On one hand of the scale you have the overconfidence, on the other side of the scale you have the fear to fail. What about your tips that you give for the people that have a fear to fail?
Yes. Usually that correlates with performing well, actually. Maybe you looked at the graph on the right hand, that the good performing students are usually the ones who are a little underconfident. So what you see there, what seems to be a reason is that those, let's say, little underconfident or fear of failure students, they have not really good ideas about how the rest is performing. So they're using the wrong information to base their judgment on. They think that others are performing better than they actually are. So they're placing themselves in the wrong, at the wrong spot in the hierarchy, so to say, performance hierarchy. And I would say that it's really relevant to make them aware of that, to make them aware of the fact that they're doing well, and to show them that they're actually performing a lot better than most of them are. So I think that is a very important factor. Yeah.
Okay. Yes, Johan.
Johan Maastricht. I'm also very impressed by your performance, by the way. But the gap between the scale where you are and the overconfidence is something which I missed in your talk. Maybe that's another paper, or maybe I just slipped my attention at that moment. But it's interesting to see that it's in particular in the lower tail of the results that the overconfidence takes place. And that's also very important, I think, for policy reasons. So maybe you could comment a little bit more on that.
Yes, well, the gap is largest there. And there is, of course, a sort of a statistical reason for it as well. People who are performing well, there's not a lot of room for them to be overconfident. It's likely that they will be more realistic or even underconfident.
I know some people who perform very well, but are extremely overconfident also. So
yeah.
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah. Yeah. What you see is that people tend to externally attribute failure. So when they haven't done well on a test, what they tend to say is, well, the test was awful, or the person next to me was making a lot of noise, or whatever, I had a bad night's sleep. But that's all external attribution. And the question is whether it wouldn't be better if they would be more aware of the fact that their study behavior is suboptimal, that they're not doing as well as they should be doing, and that it is their study behavior that is causing this enormous discrepancy. But the interesting thing is that, well, students are unaware of this enormous discrepancy, even though they get regular grades. I mean, you would say that in education, getting grades is good feedback, but still, this discrepancy is there.
Thank you. Hildegard.
Hildegard Schneider, Law Faculty. Very impressive presentation. My question is whether there is a gender differentiation between overconfidence, because in my experience, and it is also in the light of the results, female students tend to be less overconfident, while male students tend. So can you also back this in your research?
Yes. There tends to be a gender difference, but it's not that outspoken. It depends a little on the task as well. For example, stock investors, who are usually male, there you see a huge difference because the males are much more overconfident and therefore also take more risks. And that's actually why you see usually in these experiments that females are doing better as investors. In education, there are not a lot of results on this actually. It doesn't seem to be that big of a difference. The poor performers are the ones who are overestimating themselves the most. But of course, we also know that the poor performers are more often the males. So in that sense, the question is, what is chicken and what is egg? Yeah.
So, yes.
Well, my name is Didier Fouarge. I'm from ROA. I have two short questions. First, could you tell us something on the relationship between overconfidence and study results and IQ or other measures of cognition? And the second, since the test that you took involved reading interesting stuff, whereas being a student doesn't always involve reading interesting stuff, especially in the mind of people. So are you not afraid that you overestimate the relationship, the correlation of overconfidence? Because sometimes you have to read very boring stuff and read it because it's important to know that. And then you might be more tempted to remember things coming from interesting text, but not from boring text.
Yes, I think, okay, so your remark is actually that when people read, they focus on something they find really interesting, and then they ignore that they hadn't understood the rest of it. And I think that illustrates that people use superficial information when giving a judgment. What they should be doing is self-testing their knowledge of the complete chapter, and not just realizing that they've understood part of it and really like part of it. That's a really superficial judgment they're giving then. And that's why overestimation indeed also occurs, because people tend to focus on a fragment of the text instead of the whole text. And it is, of course, a really difficult task. I mean, for a student to realize, have I understood everything that is in this chapter, is really difficult. And that is actually why I think that there should be more research on how instruction can improve this. I mean, the keywords helps. Just having them provide 5 keywords helps them focus on, have I understood everything about this chapter? So that is indeed why I think it's important to look at instruction.
Over there.
Harm Hospers, FHS. I'm a bit confused why you would use correlations as measures, because it seems to be that when you say a higher correlation shows less overconfidence. But if everyone systematically has, for example, a one point on a 10-point scale, a 1 point higher over, everyone would be overconfident and the correlation would be 1.
Yes, well, I took a little road of simplicity in this presentation because I don't have the time to explain it, but the correlation actually just measures the overlap between their performance and their actual, and their judgment. But if you look at overconfidence, you see this gap. But what you mainly see is when this correlation is that low, that there is this gap. But of course, you need something else to calculate that. You're right. That's a real good remark.
One last question over here.
Thank you. Jean Mures from the Vocational Training for General Practitioners. I think it's very good that you, in the light of the strategic program of this university, have a topic that is generalizable to a lot of contents. I acknowledge that your study was on students, primary care students and college students, but you also talked about managers, cyclists, etc. So I think it's very generalizable. My question is, what would be a good gold standard to grade, being a manager, to grade managers? You said, let them talk to their peers and to their supervisors. Yeah. But is that really the gold standard to increase the performance of managers?
Yeah. I think in, let's say, complex working environments, such as a manager, it's important to use a multifaceted approach, because there's not a gold standard. There's not something, as in a mathematical problem, a solution, and if you perform like this, then you're the best manager. So you need a multifaceted approach, wherein feedback from peers, supervisors, but also I would say look outside your own company and look at what you think are good managers in other companies or in other countries, or what are the good examples, and try to define what makes them the good managers and compare yourself against that. But, well, use feedback from different sources and discuss it and talk about it. Yeah.
Thank you. Time is over. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Karen.